You think an old man like me can't hit the target? The voice was low, but there was a quiet confidence in it that made the air tense. The 06 Marines laughed, their chuckles echoing across the shooting range, their arrogance as thick as the summer heat. It wasn't just a mockery of the old man standing before them, it was a dismissal of everything he represented. His name was Jack McAllister, but to them, he was just another relic of a forgotten time, a fading echo of a war that they only read about in books. The Marines were young, fueled by the arrogance of youth, the pride of their fresh uniforms, and the belief that they were the best. They were invincible. And yet here he stood, with nothing more than an old rifle and a weathered face. "Move along, old man," one of them jeered, flicking his rifle, as if to hurry Jack off the line. The others nodded, the laughter growing louder. Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. He just shifted his weight, adjusting his stance, his eyes steady on the target downrange. His hands, though old and weathered, moved with the precision of a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and survived. The mocking didn't faze him. His mind was elsewhere, back in a time when the world wasn't so full of youth and arrogance. When survival depended on more than just muscle and gear. He thought of the jungles of Vietnam, the endless days where the weight of life and death hung in the balance, where every shot counted. He thought of the men who relied on him, the friends he lost, and the ones who owed their lives to the accuracy of his aim. His fingers touched the barrel of the rifle, his body remembering the rhythm, the familiar weight of the weapon. It was a far cry from the high-tech gear these Marines used, but it didn't matter. The rifle was an extension of him, as much a part of him as the bones in his body. The target sat a few hundred yards away, a simple silhouette. It wasn't much, but Jack had learned long ago that it wasn't the size of the target that mattered, it was the focus. He closed his eyes for a moment, his breath even and calm, the sound of his pulse ringing in his ears. Then, without a word, he fired. The shot cracked through the silence, the sound sharp and loud. The Marines froze, their laughter dying in an instant as the target shattered in the distance, a clean hit that rang out like a slap across the face. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind, the deep breath of the old veteran, and the stunned silence of the young Marines. They stood there, staring at the broken target, the reality of what they had just witnessed sinking in. The old man had done what they thought impossible. He had hit the target, effortlessly, in a way none of them had even come close to. Jack lowered the rifle, his face expressionless. He didn't need to say a word. The truth had already been made clear. The young Marines had been so sure of themselves, so certain that age and experience had no place in this modern world of machines and technology. But Jack had proven them wrong. They weren't the best because they had the newest gear or the latest training. They were the best because they had forgotten something essential: respect. Respect for the men who came before them, for the ones who had fought and bled, for the ones who had learned the hard way that experience, not arrogance, won the day. One of the Marines, Lance Corporal Bradshaw, stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment. You're the one they called Legal Eye, aren't you?" Jack didn't respond. His silence was all that was needed. The Marines, now humbled, stood at attention. The lesson was clear. Experience could never be underestimated. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, as the Marines stood frozen, their eyes locked on the shattered target. The breeze carried the faint scent of the nearby trees, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves. Jack McAllister remained still, his rifle lowered, the weight of the moment settling over him like a cloak. It wasn't the first time he had proven a point with a single shot. In fact, it had become almost second nature, hitting what seemed impossible, quieting the doubts of those around him. But today, it felt different. The young Marines were staring at him, some with a mix of awe, others with embarrassment, but all with a newfound respect. Lance Corporal Bradshaw, who had been the loudest in his mockery, took a hesitant step forward. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by something more uncertain, more humble. I didn't know," Bradshaw muttered, his voice trailing off. Jack didn't respond. There was no need for words, the lesson had already been delivered in the simplest way possible. His eye scanned the Marines, each one now silent, their previous cocky attitudes fading away. He could feel the weight of their gaze, not filled with ridicule now, but with understanding. He had earned their respect in a way that didn't require an explanation. "You can all talk the talk," Jack finally said, his voice gravelly but steady. "But when it comes time to walk the walk, it's about more than just the gear and the gadgets. It's about knowing what to do when it matters most." His words hung in the air, each one a quiet reminder of the vast difference between knowing the theory and living the experience. The Marines had learned that lesson the hard way. As the seconds passed, the tension slowly began to lift, replaced by a hum of realization. Bradshaw took another step forward, now standing just a few feet away from Jack. "You were the one," Bradshaw said softly, his words almost reverent. "The one they talked about back at boot camp, the one with the impossible shots, the one they said could hit anything from miles away." Jack nodded slightly. He wasn't one for the stories or the myths that surrounded his name. He had never cared much for the legend they had built around him. To him, it was all just another part of the war, another way to survive, another reason to keep going. But seeing the young Marine's recognition made something inside him shift, just slightly. "I don't do it for the stories," Jack said, his gaze steady. "I did it to stay alive. And to keep others alive. That's all that matters in the end." The Marine stood there for a moment longer, still absorbing the weight of his words. And then, one by one, they began to move. First, Sergeant Williams stepped forward and gave Jack a brief but respectful nod, the kind that spoke volumes. Then, one by one, the rest followed suit, each of them silently acknowledging what Jack had shown them today. It wasn't just about the shot. It wasn't even about the rifle. It was about the years of experience, the quiet strength, the kind of wisdom you couldn't learn from books or simulators. The kind of wisdom that came from living through things you didn't want to remember. The kind of wisdom that Jack McAllister had lived through, and that he now shared with them, without a single word of self-promotion. It was the kind of wisdom that earned respect, not by demanding it, but by simply being what you were. As the last of the Marines left the range, Jack remained standing by the target. His rifle still in hand, but now there was no need to prove anything. The lesson had been learned. The respect had been earned. The Marines slowly gathered their gear, still processing the lesson they had just learned. The tension in the air had lifted, but the quiet respect remained. Lance Corporal Bradshaw, who had once mocked Jack with the harshest words, now stood at the edge of the group, looking over at him with a different expression, a mixture of respect and something else, something Jack couldn't quite place. He knew better than to ask. Instead, he adjusted his cap, the motion slow and deliberate, his eyes scanning the distant horizon. The world had a way of putting things into perspective, and Jack had long since learned that silence often spoke louder than words. "Sir," Bradshaw said finally, his voice hesitant but not mocking. "I didn't know who you were. I mean, I've heard the stories, but I never really believed them. It's different when you see it in person." Jack glanced over at him, his eyes unreadable. He nodded slowly, his mind drifting back to the many years he had spent in the field, where stories were often more myth than fact. "Stories," Jack muttered, "are what others tell themselves to make sense of the world. The truth is usually far simpler." Bradshaw shifted on his feet, still not sure how to process what had just happened. "But how?" Bradshaw asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "How did you do it? I mean, you've got to be at least 80, right? That kind of skill, how does it stay with you?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He let the question hang in the air, feeling the weight of it. How did it stay with him? It wasn't something he could explain in a few words. It wasn't just about shooting or surviving, it was about everything he had seen, everything he had done, and everything he had lost. "It's not about age, Bradshaw," Jack finally said, his voice calm and steady. "It's about muscle memory. It's about doing the same thing so many times that it becomes part of you. It's about knowing that when you pull that trigger, you're not just taking a shot at a target. You're taking a shot at survival. And that doesn't go away, no matter how old you get." Bradshaw nodded, though the words seemed to be sinking in slowly. It wasn't just the technical skill, it was the experience behind it, the weight of years spent honing that skill until it was second nature. "I get it," Bradshaw said quietly, his respect now evident in his voice. "You're not just some old guy with a gun. You're the real deal." Jack offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. He wasn't one for grand speeches or displays of emotion. The world had taught him that action spoke louder than words. And today, his actions had done the talking. "Remember that," Jack said. "It's not about what you see on the surface. It's about what's underneath. And if you're lucky, you'll realize that before it's too late." The Marines stood in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts, reflecting on the encounter they had just witnessed. Jack's words lingered in the air, a reminder that experience, not arrogance, was what truly made a person valuable. The sound of the wind was the only thing that broke the silence, and Jack slowly began to walk away, his steps steady, unhurried, and purposeful. The Marines watched him go, knowing that they had just witnessed something more powerful than a mere demonstration of skill. They had witnessed the quiet strength of a man who had seen and survived the worst of it all. And in that moment, they realized they had more to learn than they had ever imagined. The next morning, the Marines gathered for their usual training, but today felt different. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts, each man lost in his own head, processing the events from the day before. Lance Corporal Bradshaw was the first to break the silence. He approached Jack McAllister, who was sitting alone on the bench near the edge of the training field, his rifle resting at his side. "Hey, Jack," Bradshaw said, his tone less formal than before, more respectful. Jack looked up, meeting his eyes without a hint of surprise. The younger man stood there for a moment, as if unsure of what to say next. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about muscle memory, about survival. I guess I didn't really get it before," Bradshaw admitted, his voice quieter now. Jack nodded slowly, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Most don't. Takes time to learn that some things go deeper than just what you see." Bradshaw shifted, clearly trying to make sense of it all. "I guess I always thought that skill was something you could just teach, you know? Something that could be learned in a few weeks, with enough drills and practice. But what you did, that's not something you can teach in a class." Jack's eye softened as he listened. It wasn't the first time someone had come to this realization, and it wouldn't be the last. "No," Jack said, his voice steady. "You can't teach what you learn in the field. It's the difference between knowing something in theory and having it stamped into your soul. You only get that after living it, over and over again, until it becomes part of you." Bradshaw was quiet for a moment, the weight of Jack's words settling in. He hadn't just witnessed a marksmanship demonstration yesterday, he had seen something much deeper. He had seen the embodiment of experience, of years spent in the trenches where every decision, every action, carried the weight of survival. "I get it now," Bradshaw said, finally. "You weren't just showing us how to shoot, you were showing us how to survive." Jack's gaze lingered on Bradshaw for a moment longer, the young Marine's words resonating with something deep inside him. "That's right," Jack replied quietly. "It's not about being the best shot on the range. It's about knowing what to do when everything goes wrong, when it's not just about you anymore. It's about making sure you don't let the guy next to you down." Bradshaw stood silently, letting those words sink in. The other Marines were beginning to gather, but he remained where he was, processing everything Jack had shared. He realized now that Jack wasn't just some old man reliving past glories. He was a man who had lived through things most people would never understand, a man who carried the weight of survival in a way that made him stronger than any Marine with the latest equipment or the highest rank. "I think we could all learn a lot from you, Jack," Bradshaw said, his voice sincere. Jack didn't respond right away, but when he did, his words were simple. "You're already learning. That's the first step." As the Marines gathered for their morning exercises, Jack stood up slowly, adjusting his gear. He wasn't there to teach them. He was just there to show them, to remind them that real strength came not from how you looked, but from what you had lived through and survived. The young Marines followed his lead, not with words, but with action, showing respect in the only way they knew how, by being better, by learning from their mistakes, and by never forgetting the lesson Jack had given them. He had shown them that true strength wasn't about power or force. It was about the quiet, unyielding will to survive, to protect, and to never give up, no matter how much time had passed. The days that followed were different. Jack McAllister had expected things to return to normal, the usual banter and challenges that came with training. But as he walked across the training field, the atmosphere had shifted. The young Marines no longer laughed or mocked. Instead, they respected his presence, giving him the space to do what he did best, teach without words. Lance Corporal Bradshaw was the first to approach him again, his usual swagger replaced with a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. "Jack," Bradshaw said, his voice respectful. "I've been thinking. You never really told us what you did before. I mean, you just showed us how to survive, but I'm curious. What made you like that?" Jack stopped and turned to face him, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. The question wasn't new. He had been asked similar ones over the years. But something about the sincerity in Bradshaw's voice made him pause. He didn't want to talk about the past. It wasn't something he liked to revisit. The memories were too raw, too painful. But in that moment, Jack realized that maybe the best way to help these young men was to show them what they needed to know, not just about shooting or tactics, but about life. "I've been many things," Jack began slowly, his voice low. "A soldier, a survivor, a teacher. But the one thing I always was, Bradshaw, was someone who learned the hard way." Bradshaw listened intently, his eyes fixed on Jack as if he was trying to absorb every word. Jack could see the curiosity in his face. He could see that Bradshaw wasn't asking out of respect for the past, but because he genuinely wanted to understand. "I wasn't always the man you see before you," Jack continued, his gaze drifting to the horizon, lost in the memories. "When I was your age, I thought I knew everything. I was tough, cocky, and sure that nothing could break me. But life has a way of humbling you. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. And I've learned that being tough isn't enough. You need something deeper. You need the kind of experience that makes you realize you can't do it all alone." Bradshaw nodded, his expression serious now. He understood the weight of Jack's words. Jack could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just listening, he was starting to comprehend. "You've been through a lot," Bradshaw said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. Jack gave a small nod. "Yeah, I have. And I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But that's what makes you who you are. That's what makes you strong, not the physical stuff, not the gear you carry, but what you've lived through. You carry that with you, and it never goes away." Bradshaw stood silently for a moment, processing what Jack had said. It wasn't just the lessons about tactics, about precision, that Jack had been trying to teach. It was about the strength that came from surviving the unthinkable, from carrying the scars of the past without letting them define you. Bradshaw spoke again, his voice steady. "I get it now. It's not about being the toughest guy in the room. It's about knowing what you've been through, and knowing that you can handle whatever comes next." Jack smiled slightly, a rare expression that spoke of the quiet pride he felt. "Exactly. The real strength isn't in how you look or how much weight you can carry. It's in knowing that when the chips are down, you'll be there. You'll keep going, no matter what." The Marines began to gather for their next exercise, the weight of Jack's words still hanging in the air. They were different now, each of them carrying a new understanding, a new respect for the man who had shown them not just how to shoot, but how to survive. Jack watched them for a moment, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. They weren't just soldiers. They were learning to be more. They were learning to be the kind of men who understood that true strength came from within, from the lessons of the past, and from the will to keep going when everything seemed impossible. Days passed, and Jack McAllister remained an enigma to the young Marines. They had seen his skill, felt the depth of his experience, but there was still so much they didn't understand. The training sessions had become quieter, more focused, as if the men had begun to see through the surface and grasp something deeper. Lance Corporal Bradshaw had spent most of the time reflecting, no longer the cocky Marine he once was. He had started to notice the little things, the way Jack moved, the way he observed, the calm in his eyes that seemed to tell 1,000 stories without uttering a word. One afternoon, after an intense training exercise, Bradshaw found himself standing beside Jack again. This time, there were no questions about shooting, no challenges to his skill. Instead, there was just a silent understanding between them, a bond forged through shared experiences and the quiet respect that had grown over the past few days. "Jack, how do you do it?" Bradshaw asked, his voice almost hesitant. "How do you stay so calm?" Jack turned his gaze toward him, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about staying calm, Bradshaw. It's about knowing what's worth getting worked up over." Bradshaw nodded, but it didn't completely make sense to him. He had seen Jack in high-stress situations, and the man never seemed to flinch. "You know, the guys," Bradshaw began, but Jack held up a hand, cutting him off. "It's not about them, either. It's about you. It's about what you can control. When everything's falling apart around you, when everyone else is losing their heads, that's when you need to stay steady. Because the moment you let the chaos in, you've already lost." The words resonated with Bradshaw, but he still couldn't quite grasp how Jack made it seem so simple. Jack continued, sensing the question that still lingered in the young Marine's mind. "I've been in enough situations where panic would have killed me, Bradshaw. And it wasn't the toughest guys who made it out. It was the ones who knew how to breathe, how to think. That's what experience gives you, the ability to see through the storm and focus on the next step." Bradshaw looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. It was true. He had witnessed Jack's calm before, in moments when others would have cracked. It wasn't just about being tough, it was about being in control of your mind, even when the world around you was anything but. "I don't know how you do it," Bradshaw admitted, his voice low but filled with a newfound respect. Jack didn't smile or respond with words. Instead, he stood up, adjusting his gear, his movement slow but deliberate. He didn't need to explain anymore. Bradshaw understood now. It wasn't about Jack being invincible, it was about the way he handled the things that others couldn't. It was the way he carried his years, not as a burden, but as a quiet strength. The other Marines watched as Jack walked away, his pace steady, his presence commanding even without saying a word. They had all seen it now, the kind of strength that wasn't born of brute force or equipment, but of knowing who you were and being comfortable with it. As Bradshaw watched him go, he realized that Jack had given them something far more valuable than just training. He had shown them what it meant to truly survive, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. And that was a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The days went by, and with each passing one, the Marines started to change. It wasn't just the training that was different now, it was the way they saw themselves, and the way they saw each other. The respect Jack had earned from them wasn't something that could be shaken off after a few days. It had settled in deep, something they carried with them as they went about their duties, something that made them think twice before laughing off the next older veteran who walked through the gate. Lance Corporal Bradshaw was one of the first to change. No longer the brash young Marine who thought he had all the answers, he now approached his training with a different mindset. He was no longer concerned with proving himself in front of his peers. His focus had shifted, and it wasn't about outdoing the man next to him, it was about outdoing himself. Jack McAllister had shown him that, and though the old veteran was still a mystery to him in many ways, he knew he had learned something invaluable. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the Marines were finishing up a particularly tough drill. They were tired, their muscles sore, but there was no grumbling, no complaints. They had all become accustomed to pushing past their limits. Bradshaw stood in the back of the group, his eyes scanning the others, watching as they went through the motions, each of them giving their best. That's when Jack appeared, walking slowly toward the group, his pace as steady and sure as ever. He wasn't here to lead the exercise. He wasn't here to show them anything new. He was just here, a quiet presence among them. Bradshaw walked over to him, his footsteps purposeful. "Jack," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of respect and curiosity. You ever think about, well, what's next? Jack raised an eyebrow, his expression thoughtful. What's next? He asked. Yeah, like what comes after all this. After the training, after everything we're doing here. Bradshaw gestured to the group. Do you ever think about when we're not soldiers anymore? Jack took a moment, as if considering the question, then let out a slow breath. I think about it, sure. But it's not the thinking that matters. It's the doing. It's about knowing that when your time comes, you'll be ready, no matter what it is. Bradshaw stared at him, trying to grasp the depth of the response. I don't think I understand, he admitted. Jack looked at him, his eyes steady, filled with the weight of years. You don't have to understand now, Jack said. You'll understand when the time comes. It's not about what comes after. It's about making sure you're ready for whatever comes next. And that's something you do every day, with every choice you make, with every action you take. Bradshaw nodded, the words sinking in slowly, but he could feel it. He could feel the truth in them. It wasn't about the end game. It was about how you lived in the moment, how you prepared for what was coming next. And in that moment, Bradshaw understood more than just Jack's words. He understood the man. Jack McAllister wasn't just a soldier who had seen too much, who had lived through battles and wars. He was a man who knew the true meaning of survival, not just in battle, but in life. Jack's ability to move through the world with quiet confidence, to live each day as it came, was something the young Marines could only hope to emulate. And as Bradshaw watched the old man walk away, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Jack hadn't just taught him how to shoot or how to survive. He had taught him how to live with purpose. It was a lesson that would stay with him forever, a lesson he would carry with him long after the drills and the training had ended. He had learned that strength wasn't just about muscle, and survival wasn't just about outlasting the enemy. It was about outlasting yourself, outlasting your own doubts, and finding a way to keep moving forward, no matter what. Weeks passed, and the Marines settled into their new rhythm. The respect they had for Jack McAllister didn't fade, it only grew. The training became more intense, but also more focused. There was less showmanship, less trying to prove who was the strongest, and more genuine effort to better themselves. Bradshaw, especially, had taken Jack's words to heart. He no longer rushed through exercises, seeking to finish first, but instead, took his time to perfect each movement. It wasn't about speed or bravado anymore. It was about quality, about making sure that every action counted. One morning, after a particularly challenging drill, the Marines were gathered in a circle, their bodies worn from hours of practice. They were sweaty and tired, but they were more focused than ever before. Jack stood off to the side, leaning against a fence, watching them without saying a word. Bradshaw approached him, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Jack, Bradshaw said, his voice calm, yet filled with a quiet respect. You ever miss it? Being out there in the field. Jack looked at him, his expression unreadable. It wasn't a question he had been asked often, but it was one he had asked himself many times over the years. Sometimes, Jack replied, his voice low, as though remembering something far away. But I don't miss the fight. I miss the purpose. I miss knowing that every day mattered, that every step you took meant something. Out there, you weren't just surviving, you were living for something greater than yourself. You were part of something bigger. Bradshaw nodded, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. He hadn't fully understood it before, but now, he did. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about living with purpose. In the field, every moment counted. Here, it felt different. It was as if they were just going through the motions, running drills without the same urgency, without the same sense of meaning that Jack had spoken of. I guess that's what we're all trying to find, right? Bradshaw said, his voice thoughtful. A purpose. Jack nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the rest of the group. Purpose is everything. Without it, you're just going through the motions. But once you find it, everything changes. You'll fight harder. You'll endure more. And you'll never quit, because you'll know exactly why you're doing it. Bradshaw looked out at the Marines, each of them still catching their breath after the drill. They were all tired, some already packing up to leave for the day. But there was something different now. They weren't just soldiers in training. They were men on a path to something greater. Bradshaw felt it in himself, too. He was no longer just a Marine looking for validation. He was a Marine with a purpose. "I think I get it," Bradshaw said, his voice steady. "It's not just about the training. It's about finding why we're doing it, right?" Jack smiled slightly, his eyes reflecting a wisdom that came from years of living and surviving. "Exactly," he said quietly. "It's about the reason behind every action. The reason behind every breath." As the Marines began to leave, Bradshaw stayed behind for a moment, taking it all in. He looked at Jack, who stood quietly by the fence, as if waiting for something. Maybe Jack was waiting for them to understand. Maybe he was waiting for them to find their own purpose, the way he had. It didn't matter, though. Bradshaw had found his own purpose that day, not just in the drills or in the strength he had built, but in the realization that everything they did, every struggle they faced, had a deeper meaning. It wasn't just about the fight. It was about living for something that mattered. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of daily life on the training ground settled into a steady, familiar pattern. But the Marines were no longer the same. The lessons they had learned, not just about marksmanship or tactics, but about themselves and each other, had reshaped their way of thinking. Bradshaw, now more focused and disciplined than ever, had become a quiet leader among them, his confidence no longer born from arrogance, but from a deep understanding of what it truly meant to be a soldier. Jack McAllister's influence had seeped into every part of their training, from the way they held their rifles to the way they carried themselves off the field. One evening, after another grueling day of drills, the group sat around the campfire. It was the kind of night where the stars seemed to stretch on forever, the night air cool but not cold, and the fire crackled in front of them, casting long shadows on their faces. Jack sat apart from the group, as usual, not because he didn't want to be part of the camaraderie, but because he knew the value of solitude. But tonight, something felt different. Bradshaw stood up, his voice carrying through the stillness of the evening. "Jack," he said, his voice clear, no longer uncertain. "You've taught us more than any instructor ever could. Not just how to shoot, not just how to fight, but how to live." The group fell silent, all eyes on Bradshaw, who had never been the one to speak out like this. But Jack only nodded, his eyes softening. "You've been teaching us all along," Bradshaw continued. "But you never said it outright. You didn't need to." "That's the point," Jack replied, his voice gravelly but steady. "You don't need to say everything. Some lessons are learned through what you do, not what you say." There was a pause, the fire crackling as the Marines let his words settle in. It wasn't just the physical strength they had developed on the field. It was the mental resilience, the quiet understanding that being a soldier wasn't just about survival, it was about purpose, discipline, and knowing that every action mattered. "You showed us that," Bradshaw said, his voice quieter now. "You showed us how to be men, not just Marines." Jack glanced up at him, a faint smile crossing his face. "You're getting it," he said, nodding. "It's not about being the best, Bradshaw. It's about being the best version of yourself. And the best version of yourself isn't the one who wins every battle. It's the one who stands up when it matters most." The words hung in the air, a reminder of everything they had learned, of everything Jack had instilled in them. The Marines sat in silence for a while, each one reflecting on what they had become. They had come to respect Jack not just for his skill or his experience, but for the way he lived. He didn't seek accolades. He didn't need recognition. He simply lived with purpose, and that had taught them more than any drill ever could. As the fire burned down to embers, the group knew that they were no longer the same men who had arrived at the training grounds months ago. They had learned that strength wasn't measured by the number of targets hit or the distance covered. It was measured by the choices they made, the integrity they held, and the respect they gave to each other. and as they looked at Jack, sitting quietly by the fire, they knew that the lessons he had given them were ones they would carry for the rest of their lives.